So I'm going to talk about cognitive reserve and try to go from concept to measurement. I guess I've always been interested in measuring things all my life, and so my approach is if this is something that's interesting, we ought to be able to measure it. I want to point out that this talk, like all of the talks here, this conference is funded in part by the National Institute on Aging and a conference grant, and the views expressed in written conference materials or publications and by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply an endorsement by the U.S. government. So just wanted to make that clear in case people were worried about this earlier on. So I'm going to talk about cognitive reserve, obviously, and I'm going to ask the question, is it a useful construct? And if it is, why do we think it's a useful construct? I'm going to talk about different approaches to actually measuring cognitive reserve because, what I'm interested in is having a tape measure that I can pack around with me and measure things. And I'm going to kind of emphasize or spend most time talking about the reserve as residual approach that Laura referred to. And then I'm going to end up talking about where do we go from here? What's the future of cognitive reserve? So Laura, I think, did a nice job of talking about the heterogeneity of cognition and pathology. And I just wanted to, these are a couple of my favorite slides that I use all the time from the Rush group. And it just shows that heterogeneity is a defining feature of late life cognition. The panel on the left shows cross-sectional data, and you see lots of, even though on average people are declining, you see lots of variability around this average. The panel on the right shows individual trajectories, and you see even more variability in individual trajectories and across the whole late life age span. And you have people out in their 80s and 90s that are getting better. You have people in their 60s that are really dropping off the cliff. Heterogeneity rules in cognitive aging. Cognition is multiply determined, and in the best studies that have been done, brain injury and brain disease account for less than 50% of the variance in cross-sectional cognitive test scores. In terms of longitudinal cognitive decline, disease effects on cognition or on cognitive decline are especially salient. So you see lifestyle experience factors like education that have big impacts on cross-sectional test scores. But when you get to cognitive decline, it's disease that's the primary driver. But even here, disease still accounts for less than 50% of the variance in cognitive decline. And this is another study from the Rush group. I think they are the group that has done the most to kind of catalog every possible neuropathological variable and other kind of biological variable that can contribute to cognitive decline. And even in these studies, they show that the pathology accounts for less than 50% of cognitive decline. So there's a lot of other things that are influencing the heterogeneity in cognitive decline. And Laura talked about the mismatch between pathology and function. People with a lot of brain pathology who are perfectly normal, and this certainly is something that has changed a bit over time as we've developed more stringent neuropathological criteria for what we consider Alzheimer's disease, for example. But it's very clear that from the literature that the classic Alzheimer's disease pathology components like plaques and tangles, especially tangles, are very strongly associated with cognition and cognitive decline. Yet at the same time, it's clear, and when you actually see cases that come to autopsy, that it's not hard to find cases who had brains that looked terrible, that were atrophic, that had lots of plaques, that had lots of tangles, and who were absolutely cognitively normal, a month or 2 weeks before they died. So there clearly is this mismatch, and it raises the question, why do people with the same brain disease vary in clinical presentation? And so along comes the Calvary, the concept of cognitive reserve. So basically, reserve is a construct used to explain the variability in the impact of brain injury on cognition. And the notion, as Laura has gone over, I think is relatively straightforward. People with greater reserve are more resilient to brain injury associated with diseases of aging. The reason this is kind of exciting is that it kind of suggests that life experience factors may contribute to cognitive reserve, may build cognitive reserve, and some of these life experience factors may be modifiable. And so rather than talking about, really depressing things like how people get Alzheimer's disease and decline cognitively and functionally, it puts us in a position to think about what are factors that might protect against the effects of things like Alzheimer's disease, even if people do get that kind of pathology. Further arguing on the side of reserve, studies have shown that life experience can alter brain structure. So animal studies going back to the 1970s showed that environmental complexity in rats is related to brain complexity and to structural brain variables. Human studies have also shown a link between experience and the brain, and probably the poster child for this is the London taxi study, where they showed that hippocampal volume actually increases in London taxi drivers after they learn the layout of the street systems in London. And these kinds of sources of evidence also suggest that there may be biological and potentially modifiable mechanisms for cognitive reserve that may be experience related. So that's the case for reserve. What's the case against reserve? Well, it's a very abstract construct. It's inferred to explain complex relations between pathology and clinical outcomes. And probably one of my biggest bones to pick with the field of reserve is often these explanations are post hoc. And we all know, hopefully, that it's pretty easy to find, to take two pieces of data and what that data, and to come up with some kind of explanation that seems plausible to explain how those pieces of data might relate to one another. Whether it's correct or not is a whole different thing. And I guess the other thing that is that cognitive reserve, the conceptualization, may be unnecessarily complicated. It's certainly complicated. I guess it's arguable whether it's unnecessarily complicated. And that makes my head hurt quotation. This is actually a quotation. It certainly is my experience in talking about cognitive reserve. But in 2009 at Friday Harbor, we had a conference that was themed around cognitive reserve. And Yakov Stern was there, and David Bennett was also there. And this is a quotation from David Bennett. He said that in the course of going to various conferences that he and Yakov pretty much rode the same circuit and to conferences on cognitive reserve. And every time he heard Yakov talk, it made his head hurt. And David is a really smart guy, and if it makes his head hurt, I don't feel so bad that it makes my head hurt. But my biggest problem with the notion of cognitive reserve is that I think a lot of the work in this field is there's inadequate construct validation. And that's kind of one of the main messages of what I'm going to talk about today and my approach to this. So what are there's, Laura has already gone over the approaches to measuring reserve. I'm going to talk about three of them: proxy variables, moderators of brain cognition relations, and the residual reserve index. I'm going to spend more time on the reserve index. So reserve proxies. This is probably the most common approach, and it uses presumed proxy variables, things like education. Education probably accounts for 75% of the literature on cognitive reserve. Socioeconomic status, occupational attainment, measures of crystallized intelligence, single word reading, a variety of things like that. In many studies, reserve is inferred to explain the results. Reserve isn't input into the study. Variables like education are input, and then you see the kind of associations with dementia incidence, for example, that Laura showed, and cognitive reserve is brought forth as a construct to explain why education is behaving like it does. But there also are studies that simply assume that the proxy variables measure reserve, and the proxy is actually labeled reserve. So what are the limitations of this approach? And I don't mean to beat on any approach here, and I'm going to be critical of all of the approaches. But my biggest concern about the proxy route is coming back to construct validation. I think in many cases the construct validation of the proxy as a reserve indicator has been inadequate. And then the other thing is that, being kind of concrete in my thinking, it seems like if you know that a specific proxy variable influences cognition in a specific way, why do you call it reserve? If you know that education influences incident dementia in a specific way, why call that cognitive reserve? Why not call that education? And if you don't know why it's doing that, coming back to Gerald's question, then let's try to find the variables, the components of education that are accounting for that. So the moderator study. So I think the Rush group and Bharat Rajan is going to be talking about some of these studies later on, have really taken this approach and run with it and have done some very, very nice work. So preserved reserve indicators are examined in regression models as moderators of brain effects on cognition. And the reserve effect is captured by the reserve indicator by brain interaction effect. So the idea is that variables that interact with brain variables that modify the impact of brain variables provide empirical evidence of reserve, essentially. And in this case, construct validity is built in because the interaction effect is a strong empirical test of the construct validity of the reserve indicator. So this approach can effectively identify specific variables as indicators of reserve. And again, I think the Rush group has really, there's an enormous volume of literature where they've shown a lot of different life experience and all kinds of different variables that modify the impact of neuropathology. But if there's a problem, it doesn't really separate the reserve from non-reserve components of those variables. So, some of those variables might contribute to reserve through some mechanisms, but a lot of their variability may have nothing to do with reserve, so it doesn't really separate that. And at the end of the day, you don't have a measure of reserve that can be used as a target in studies to clarify the mechanisms of reserve. So that leads us to the residual reserve index approach. And this here, reserve is operationalized as the difference between observed cognitive function and the expected cognitive function based on what you know about the brain and, in our case, of demographic variables. So a person whose cognitive performance is better than expected has higher reserve, and this provides a direct measure of reserve that can be interrogated in construct validity studies. And it also, so basically you have a measure of reserve that can be used for studying what kind of lifestyle or biological or genetic variables may be associated with reserve. So how does this relate to the moderator approach? So actually, I'm not showing a moderation effect here, but it's kind of so this is the regression approach where you have brain variables, you may have demographic variables, and you have a reserve indicator. And this is the Rush sort of approach. So if you have an independent effect of the reserve indicator on cognition independent of these variables, that's evidence of reserve. And actually stronger evidence of reserve is if you have an arrow going from here to here, if the reserve indicator moderates the effect of brain on cognition. Now, the reservist residual approach kind of starts out from this kind of place. So you're regressing cognition on demographics and brain, and you're capturing as a latent variable something that you call the reserve index. That's what we're going to label that latent variable. And then you can take your reserve indicator, whether it's education or level of cognitive activity, and you can see how that reserve indicator relates to your operational measure of reserve here. And that's the basic approach. These two models are essentially the same. You're doing the same thing statistically. They're just different parameterizations, and here you're actively capturing a latent variable that reflects residual cognition after you explain these two variables. So we published a paper in 2010, Bruce Reed was the primary author, in which we looked at the development and validation of the residual reserve index approach. And Rich Jones for years has had an axiom that only one goofy idea per manuscript. And clearly in this case, the goofy idea is that a statistical residual could be used as a measure of reserve. And this paper came out after the 2009 Cognitive Reserve Conference, and we talked about this approach at that conference. And there was some skepticism, and let's say there was stimulated discussion about this. But I think the thing that compensated for the goofy part of this is we went to great lengths to empirically test the construct validity of this residual measure as a measure of reserve. So we set up a variety of a priori hypotheses that are essentially empirical tests of this as reserve. We said that reserve should be lower in individuals with greater clinical impairment. If you're demented, makes sense you have less reserve than if you're not. It should be associated with other known indicators of reserve, things like single word reading, for example, we used in our study. It should be associated with rate of future cognitive decline. If it's going to be of any value, it should predict it. It should separate who's going to decline faster and who's going to decline slower. And the most stringent test of the reserve hypothesis was that it should moderate the brain effect on cognition. So, much as the Rush studies have done, does this actually, if you have higher reserve, are you less susceptible to neuropathology or brain injury? So this is the latent variable model that we developed to study this, and basically we're going to look at this in a lot more detail tonight. But we had brain measures. These are volumetric brain measures of total brain volume, hippocampal volume, and white matter hyperintensity volume. We had demographic variables, education, sex, and race ethnicity. And the approach that we took was we used a measure of episodic memory. This is cross-sectional. And we decomposed the episodic memory measure into three orthogonal components. A brain component, which is the variance in episodic memory explained by the brain variables. A demographic component, which is the variance explained by the demographic variables. And a residual component, which is the component that neither of these things explained. The sample was about 300 people. It included mostly normal, but also MCI, a lot of MCI and some demented cases. Demographically diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, and education. And so, I'm going to go through this stuff fairly quickly because this is an old study now. But in terms of, we decompose memory into three components. About 20% of episodic memory was explained by demographics, about 20% was explained by brain, and about 50% wasn't explained by either of those things. So 50% was the residual reserve index. And I'm going to go over these things. These are some of the hypotheses, and I'll summarize the results here later on, but they were the upstream hypotheses. This is the one that we most cared about, and this is the moderation effect. And so let me see if I can explain this graph. So this is, on the x-axis is the brain status variable. Lower scores mean worse brains, higher scores mean better brains. On the y-axis is annual rate of cognitive decline in a non-memory cognitive domain. And then we have model-derived trajectories for 3 different levels of the residual reserve index. -1, this would be people that had low reserve. 0, this is average, and 1, these are people that have high reserve. So basically what you see is that the association of cognitive decline with our brain measure is much stronger in the people that have low reserve. And in the people that have high reserve, it actually isn't significantly different from 0. So this is exactly what you would expect if this was a decent measure of reserve. So briefly to summarize, the reserve index in this study was associated with clinical status, was associated with an education influence proxy for reserve, single word reading, predicted cognitive decline in a different domain, and modified the effect of baseline brain on cognitive decline in a different domain. And then this kind of comes back to Gerald's question. I said I would try to confuse things even more. So this is from the 2009 conference, and this is from the same study as that horrendous structural model that Laura showed. And so we measured the reserve index based on neuropathology and cognition in the Rush studies. And then we looked at how education, lifetime SES, cognitive activity at age 40, and cognitive activity in the present related to our index of reserve. And we found that, except for lifetime SES, all of these things were related to reserve. So, that seems pretty cool. But if you'll notice something, look at this right here. That's a negative sign. When we just put education into a model alone, that was a positive sign. But when we put these cognitive activity variables in here, then this goes negative. And so why would that be? And I think the best explanation for this is that, first of all, cognitive activity trumps education. Education generally is associated with higher levels of cognitive activity throughout life. But if you have a high level of education and you're not cognitively active, that's not a good thing for you. And alternatively, if you have a low level of education and you're very cognitively active, that is a good thing for you. So I guess you can't take it for granted if for us in this room that we can coast for the rest of our lives. We have to keep pedaling. And this just shows some of the inherent complexities of this kind of thing. So now I want to just end up talking about briefly. Laura has already presented this study, but this was a recent publication where we directly looked at how education modifies the brain effects on cognition, and then took it a step farther. That's not in the publication. It hasn't been published yet. Comparing effects of education and the residual reserve index. And this is basically the same cohort as the 2010 paper, but now we have more people and more follow-up especially. Similar kind of demographics. Just to briefly, there's a lot of stuff on here, but we measure 4 cognitive domains: episodic memory, semantic memory, executive functions, spatial abilities. This is done in a multi-level modeling framework. In the within level of the model, we estimate intercepts, random effect intercepts and slopes for each of these domains. And then in the between part of the model, we've done a lot of work to show that the intercepts stand alone as separate things, but the slopes are highly correlated. And so it makes sense to summarize them as a global slope secondary factor. And then we look at how education and brain change and education by brain change interaction affect the global slope. And this is from the same, this is a companion figure to what Laura showed. So the take-home point here, first of all, this down here shows the distribution. This is gray matter change, by the way. We're looking at an MRI-based measure of gray matter change, and this is annual change in cognition. So the big take-home point here, and these are model-derived trajectories, so if you have high education, the red line, you're more sensitive to gray matter change. That's not the way it's supposed to work if education promotes reserve. If you have low education, you're less susceptible to decline. But if you look here, if you'll notice here, for people who have, relatively little gray matter change, education is basically positive. If you have a middle to a lot of gray matter change, education is negative. And that leads to this slide, and this is what Laura showed. So the effects of education differ depending upon the status of your brain. It's good for you if your brain is in relatively good shape. It's maybe not so good for you if it's not. So I'm just going to skip over that because I think we've already done that. The next step here was to put into this model, and I'm not going to go into details, a residual reserve index, and to compare the effects of education with the reserve index. So the left part of the panel here are people with low residual reserve index. The right part are people with high residual reserve index. And these are model-derived trajectories for hypothetical people with low and high reserve and low and high levels of education. And so, clear take-home here is that if you have low reserve, your rate of cognitive change is much more strongly related to gray matter change rate than if you have high cognitive reserve. The other take-home point is that in both cases, the people with high education have a stronger link to gray matter change overall than people with low education. And we did test an interaction effect in this, and it wasn't significant. So let's summarize this. I think these results show that education is associated with resilience to cognitive decline at low levels of brain degeneration, but this effect reverses as brain injury increases. And the reserve index, on the other hand, is associated with greater resilience to cognitive decline across the full spectrum of brain atrophy. This suggests that education may be a good proxy for reserve in the relative absence of brain degeneration in relatively normal people, but it's not an effective measure of reserve as brain degeneration increases. So where do we go from here? I think, this conference is part of where we go from here. And we've got really a broad array of projects, and if half of these projects really bear fruit, I think this will be a great contribution to the field. I think things that we need to understand is dynamic change in reserve. Does reserve have different mechanisms in minorities? What are the brain mechanisms of reserve, both the structural and functional mechanisms? And perhaps most importantly, what modifiable life experience variables build reserve? So let's come back to the question, is reserve a useful construct? It helps to explain heterogeneity in brain cognition associations, but it does so in kind of an abstract sense that makes some people's heads hurt. But reserve ultimately summarizes the effects of unknown variables that influence cognition. So it really refers to what we don't know. It provides a label for what we don't know. And reserve will have less value as a construct as we better understand the determinants of cognition. So how can it be a useful construct? Well, if we can measure it, we can study it and things that promote it. We can study brain mechanisms, genetic and biological mechanisms. And I think our ultimate goal is to replace the hypothetical construct reserve or cognitive reserve with empirical knowledge of the mechanisms of cognitive decline and what specific variables that we do have concrete labels for relate to cognitive decline. Okay, and that's it.